and notifications.
Okay, welcome everybody. So this is the second in our Brownbag series for the Learning Resources Committee. I'm speaking today because our chair is doing what she should be doing, which is having a Brownbag lunch. And also, this is my friend and former colleague, Dr. Tori Robinson, and she's been kind enough to come over from University of Alabama, Huntsville to talk to us today. And I wonder if it's okay if maybe we just go around the room really quickly. People can time their bites and their lunches to introduce themselves quickly and talk about what, and just like a brief statement of what their own stake in multimodality might be about, and also if their comfort level maybe, if people are okay with that. So Mary, do you mind starting?
Sure. I'm Mary Quilla. I'm a librarian here, and I'd just like to learn more about it. My comfort level is okay, but it's okay with what I know, so I know there's a lot more that I don't know, so that's where I am.
My name is Jennifer Wolf, and I'm a librarian here, and I'm in the same situation. I just really would like to know more.
I'm Jennifer Williams. I'm a librarian here as well. The library down here, and also over there. There's a lot of us here. I have been working this semester with Dr. Bracewell and Dr. DeBray on a multimodal assignment for one of their classes. Apart from that, I guess my biggest stake in it is that as librarians, we need to know how to support these kinds of assignments when students come to the library.
I'm Kimberly Jack. I'm professor of English. I also work with the drama program doing costume design. I'm the really old literature person, so by nature my subject area is antiquated, but I'm always fascinated by the technology and the availability to move beyond simply textuality and orality, and add in components that I've discovered a number of visual and interactive components for medieval artifacts or medieval texts that can help students bridge that gap of centuries and make it, the material, more real, or the context more accessible. So I'm always interested in developing that because I have students who hear that they're going to be reading Old English and freak out and go, what does that have to do with anything?
I'm Pamela Keller. I'm head of the art department, and as an artist and an art teacher, I teach the design of multimodal methods. We design infographics, we design web pages, and we try to impart to the student the way that they're going to be presenting themselves in the next 5 to 10 years as artists is going to have a lot of different platforms. So, designing portfolios that will be easily viewed on a telephone, on an iPad, or a computer, or analog, because a lot of the students are still going for job interviews, and the bosses are in their 60s and 70s, and they would like an analog portfolio. So how do we still do that?
So I guess I'll just say I'm the director of the Writing Center here, and coming from tech to here, the kind of multimodal focus that from the program we came from was already built in with the writing component and the courses that were taught. So how it fits in to have multimodal support across this campus for students is something that I'm interested in still kind of testing the waters and exploring. And I'm selfishly interested in hearing you talk because you're awesome, and hearing about how your research has progressed and your ideas about this.
Hi, I'm Kevin Dupre in the English department, and I've been at conferences, national conferences in the last maybe decade, noticing how much emphasis that English conferences are putting on new literacies, for lack of a better word, and have started in my classes for the last about 3 years trying to work in multimodal projects. this semester right now. Dr. Bracewell and Jennifer Williams and I are working, as Jennifer mentioned, together on a 19th century British Studies class where we're using the technologies that the 19th century was introduced to help us sort of build this bridge between the bombardment of new technologies then and the spaces we live in now. So I don't think I'm comfortable in this new space at all. It's always felt somewhat foreign to me. It's sort of like, I speak a little bit of French, but it's definitely a foreign language to me. And I kind of feel like this space is a foreign space. I'm interested and fascinated, and I probably even exoticize it some through that. But I think it's clearly one of the most fundamentally different eras for literacy in our history of literacy. And I love that we happen to be working in that. I'm excited about it, and excited to hear you. So glad you're here.
Joy, my name is Jackie Smith, and I work in the Academic Affairs Office, and I work with Dr. Bracewell. And I'm very interested in the multimodal aspect of how we can support all the students that we have a non-traditional, basically non-traditional basis. Not all of them, but some of them. And introducing them to yet one more technology is, I want to make sure, and Joyce got done a great job in writing several of the new multimodal center. So we want to make that, highlight the ability of that facility and how it can support every discipline that we have, and how faculty can use it. Education students can use it for their EdTPA portfolios. Make it a broad base, just second nature. But I know zero about it, so I'm a blank slate.
Hi, I'm Tori Baker. I'm part of the librarian gang. I guess I'm intermediate. Like, I'm not an expert, I'm not a beginner. I try to kind of pepper it through my own course. I teach one of the research skills courses here, and I try to put in my, ooh, I want to try this and this and this, but still temper it with some of these students could be my mother or father, or grandmother or grandfather, and they have no idea what I'm throwing at them. So it's definitely a balance, trying to get in some of the cooler stuff that could actually help them and make their lives easier, while also being completely aware that they have no idea what Control-Alt-Delete does, on the computer. So sometimes it's a little frustrating on my end, because I really do want to try a bunch of different things. And I just try to temper that with my own, going to webinars and, going to cool stuff at conferences and just learning how to really fit it seamlessly into my class without someone's head popping off, which is difficult. So, intermediate. Okay.
Well, thank you guys for inviting me to come. I'm really excited. I rarely get a chance to just blather on about cool things. So my background, I was at Tech with Joy, but I was originally a digital media professional and an engineer before that. So I sort of came from the techie world into this amazing world of communication. And it's just synergy that now there's all these cool digital things happening in this space. So I have lots of cool things to tell you about. Please feel free to stop me if I'm completely unclear. I totally understand that as an engineer, I can confuse the heck out of people all the time. So I'll try to keep that in mind as I go forward. But I do think in strange ways. So if I make a connection that you guys didn't get, please let me know. So I would like to start with a little bit of the history. And I start there because when I came to Tech, I knew mostly about the tool side and very little bit about the call for multimodality in writing centers and in English, etc. I mean, I could see it manifesting in the working world, but I didn't know where it came from on this side. So I thought I would expand a little bit on that and then move from there to talking about how the call has been doing today. I've actually been doing some research into multimodality. I can give you some of that data, although I have to recall it, so it might not be exactly correct. And then last but not least, I pulled out some of my student projects and some assessment tools, and we can talk about those as well. So if I'm going too slow, going too fast, just holler at me. So in terms of where it came from, in about 1996, there was a group of preeminent professional academics who got together and I think for a week spent time essentially in one room trying to predict the future of where English and composition and writing professionals would be. And what they came up with was what they called multi-literacies. And they defined that, down the way it came to be known as multimodality. But when they first started looking at it, they called it multi-literacies. And I can talk to you about why that is. They decided that the way that we look at these technologies is really tied to the literacy behind them. So not so much being able to just consume them, but being able to understand what happens behind them and use them to, influence people and win the world and all those kinds of things. And that's tied to literacy. So they decided that a pedagogical approach would involve at least 4 areas. And they articulated this in this massive tome. If you ever read this thing, it's pretty dense. And it's one of these seminal papers that people cite all the time. And I have the name of it, A Pedagogy of Multi-Literacy, Designing Social Futures. And the 4 things that they illuminated are, and I'll go over them and how they relate, is social practice, critical framing, something they call overt instruction, and then last but not least, transformed practice. So in my mind, when I heard all these terms a few years ago, back at TAC, I was like, what does all this mean? I don't understand how you relate these things to the classroom in specific. And scholars after that started to try to parse those things together to figure out how we could work with them in the classroom. Some of the caveats to the article, written so long ago, had to do with certain limitations. So situated practices basically means making it real or making it, right? Experiencing it instead of just reading about it, actually experiencing it. And all of us who read about Dewey and all the other people who came up with other kinds of practice in the classroom, that's a very familiar concept. The scholars then said that there were 3 issues about actually practicing that in the classroom, and then they developed essentially strategies around navigating around these issues. And the first issue was sometimes when you practice something, you're not consciously aware of doing it, and then that's a problem because then maybe you can't articulate it the next time, right? The second one was just because you practice does not mean that you can necessarily critique, and without critique, you can't improve, right? So that was the second issue. And then third was related to the first one. If you can't really talk about what you've done, how then can you bring that into a new environment? So if you learn it in the classroom, how can you take it to work and use it? And so they, the things that they talked about at that workshop so long ago were to address those items. And what they came up with was the other 3 things that they listed, and I'll repeat them again. One, again, situated practice, so experiencing it in the classroom, giving students a chance to make something instead of just talk about it. The second was overt instruction, and over time, instead of what that sounds like, which sounds to me when I heard it was like, what, just give us some rules and let them run off. They sort of modified that to say, make mental models. So help them build models that they can follow and give them the models like examples and other kinds of things explicitly and have them talk about those things and relate to them. The third was critical framing. And when I read that, I thought, oh, okay, reflection. Being able to frame it so that I can reflect on it and talk about it and criticize it moving forward and possibly while you're working on it. And then last but not least was essentially transfer. How do I take that knowledge in the classroom and take it to any other context that might be helpful? So leveraging that information, my thought process came up with this, a table very similar to researchers who later worked on this. And I can send you guys this stuff if you think it might be helpful. So here's the list of the various areas. And the Calentis and Cope folks came up with it, and that was only about 4 years later. They actually, I think the meeting was in like 96, the first set of publications came out in 99, so this is not that far directly after it, which right now is almost 15 years old, right? And some of these things, they're very theoretical, but when you think about it in some of the terms I'll talk about later, you can see how it directly applies. So they, in particular, the critical framing, they talked about that more as a purpose, being able to have a purpose. And that was one of the only ones that they sort of really transformed in some ways from the original folks who came up with it. And I keep calling them folks because it was 5 of them or something like that. And they call themselves the New London Group. And that just doesn't slip off the tongue, right? So they're just folks in my mind. From that, let me just back up and sort of clarify what then multimodes are, right? Because from literacies, you know you have to have literacies in these topics, but what are the modes? Georgia Tech had a really nice acronym to help remember it. And while it's not exactly accurate, it still sticks in my head. So I constantly remember it in this way. And it's woven, which stands for written, oral, visual, electronic, and nonverbal. So, you know, the electronic is sort of, you know, not a mode, but seeing that the world is bombarded with all these digital areas, we can see how they sort of, you know, frame that in there. So from there, I look at bringing these ideas into the classroom across all those modes as essentially a synergy. So trying not to concentrate on one of these areas over and above another. So there's no prioritizing. So visual is not any more important than written is, oral is not any more important than visual is. That in some ways, these tools and these literacies all work together to help us make meaning. And that's kind of how I think of it in the class. So when I get down to the assignments, you'll see that none of my projects, at least in my classes, emphasize one mode or the other. I kind of think of them in my mind as these are not as difficult, these are sort of more difficult. So, and it might not necessarily be because there are more modes involved, it just because of the way technology is and things that we know about technology now, some things just end up being more difficult than others. So, not too long ago, a set of colleagues and myself, we did some research to survey writing and communication and composition instructors on what they would bring into the classroom in terms of digital pedagogies. And most startling, I think, from the data, and this is probably helpful to anyone developing centers, is that most instructors learn themselves. Overwhelmingly, the training has been letting us down for years and years. And now my personal theory on that is that training is often about features and not about what we can do with it. And so when we start to think about how we institute training programs, as instructors, that's what we need to concentrate on, how teachers actually use things. There's my little bit of the data from the thing. It's still underway. There's lots of interesting things from that. But moving forward, since I know you guys are mostly interested in student projects when I had Joy survey you guys, I have like 6 things that I think of when I go to develop various projects. And I think I have them here. Let's see if I can get this thing to scroll. I'm always on a Mac, so we're always scrolling the wrong way for me.
Yeah.
So I have sort of 6 steps. When I look and say, and like I say, my thought process is a little strange for most people. I think to myself, wow, I love my students to make this thing. And to me, this thing could be absolutely anything. I could say, oh, I'd love for my students to be able to make this game. So then, game being pretty complex, I then think of these 6 steps in order to get students there. Now, these are not necessarily time related, right? So in my mind, again, games take forever. For me to convince students to make games, regardless of where they start at, it's like an 8-week process. So you don't normally have those kinds of times in classrooms, so I don't normally make games. But these steps are the steps that I think of when I go to talk about some kinds of multimodal projects. These steps happen to correspond to the various tenets that came out of the New London Group research. So the first being allow students to build knowledge about a particular topic. That usually, for teachers, you know, it's a lecture or some reading or something the students do to find out more about the topic. And give them some time to synthesize that through discussion or whatever. Then the second is to give students a chance to analyze or critique that information. What I usually do, especially when one of my favorite assignments that I do is infographics, and someone talked about them here, is I pull up an infographic after they've already gotten some language centered around it, and we critique it as an entire class. That gives the students a chance to hear other people's thoughts and how everybody else sort of contextualizes that information. And we go through the whole thing meticulously, and it usually takes, and it's excruciating. It probably takes an hour depending on how complex the infographic is, because I keep prodding and keep, talking about it. Then step 3 for me would be getting them to do the same thing in smaller groups. So next day, next week, or whatever, all right, here's a different infographic. You guys talk amongst yourselves and report back to the group what you found out about this infographic. Whether it's about how it's spatially organized, whether it's about the contrast, or in my case, how often make students collect data to go into infographics, how the data is represented, whatever. We're going to have you guys take 45 minutes to an hour and come back and talk to me about what you found. And then we bring that information back together. Often in the groups, I make 2 or 3 of them look at the same sets of things, so that when they're talking later, they all have some kind of grounded information about the item. Number 4, my favorite. This requires a little technology in some ways, and in some ways not. So I've done it at TAC with whiteboards all around the wall. And then what I come in and I bring copies of infographics, and I go and I bring the worst ones I can find. Like I remember when the Hurricane Sandy swept up the East Coast, there were infographics galore about the category it was in, how much disaster it created, all kinds of stuff. So I collected a tome of all these infographics and printed them out and gave them to students in groups and said, all right, you guys know how to critique them, fix them. And then we spend a class or so fixing them, and then I have them stick on the whiteboards their creation. So they take scissors and they cut it out. I mean, it's literally a craft project. And when you have whiteboards, you can have them redraw it. Here, take a marker and redo it. When you don't, then you can have them just cut out the pieces and stick the pieces on the wall. Because then everybody, it gets curated. You come by and you say, what did you do? Why did you do it? And how did it work? Right? And I think that's one of my favorite steps, because you start to see students putting sort of 1 and 1 together to make 2, right? They start to understand, wow, what must it have taken to put this thing together? If it took me this amount of time just to redo it, right? And so that's one of my favorite steps. Step 5 then, go and make one. You guys go, and sometimes I have them make one as a group. That usually doesn't work as well as I would like. And I think for various reasons, some of that has to do with tools. Multimodal infographic making is troublesome because tools aren't as easy to make in a group. So often I have them go out and make one on their own. And then that gets peer reviewed. And we sort of have that curated again. We put them all on the wall, and we have the students walk back through all the things that they've learned. I make them share tools along the way.
I wanted to ask you more about the tools that you use. Are there like WYSIWYG kind of softwares out there that you have the students design with, or?
Absolutely. I let them, in the case of Georgia Tech, since they're like, so very techies, they usually have more knowledge of the types of tools that are out there than I ever will have. And so essentially at some point in that process, I have them come and tell me what they're using so that they can share them with the folks who haven't quite found it yet. And then I take notes. Because the next class, if the class doesn't come up with them, then I have a list. And I go, oh, did you guys discover so-and-so and so-and-so, right? And since, who has the time to go and dig out all this stuff? I mean, this stuff is just constantly being created and made, and some of it is really awesome. So for example, Pictochart is one of the ones that my students love to use. It's free. making a little account, and then they give you all the little pictures of stuff you can manipulate and put your little data in, and then, you know, one of the problems with it is that if I usually make them print a big one, right? And I'll show you an example. I want the thing to be, you know, 2x3, and I want them to experience the printing, have to go down to the fingerprint the thing out, bring it to class, all that, and pick the chart off. And only wish to make them, you know, 11 by 17. But
That's what I was going in the direction of how you can't print some of these things because they design and save as PNG files,
right.
or they're just 72 resolution.
Yeah.
And so one of the comical things about what you do and what I do is I won't let them use that software.
Yes.
I catch them using it. It's like they have to use primary source software.
Yeah.
So I just think that's curious and interesting that, that we have, I mean, we're doing the same thing with different.
Well, you're an art.
Right, we're focused on design though still. I mean,
yeah.
you're talking about design too. I mean, I'm sure you talk about color and
Absolutely,
and,
absolutely.
and the size of things, the
Absolutely.
hierarchy of it. Yes,
Yeah.
it's still design.
One of the things that I found when I first came to Tech is that students don't get training in some of the more sophisticated softwares like Photoshop, and they don't have a concept of how to create the thing using these tools. So I backed off of the, okay, use whatever you can find and work it out. Sometimes when I teach, depending on what it is, you know, I sort of draw the line. I used to teach web design. You had to do that by hand. I don't know how you can learn anything if you don't do it by. If you really want to learn how to do web design, you got to do that by hand, from my perspective. If you just want to learn how to design and how to create things, then you can use whatever tool, because then it pretty much gives you, you know, all the parts stick together. So this is sort of what I do for most of the various projects that I use. I don't always get a chance to go through all 6 of the items because, you know, limited time. For example, I'm teaching a game class for the first time. Yeah. And they're graduate students, and so we haven't really had a chance to go through as many of them as I probably should have, and when I redo this class, I'll be sure to add a few more steps in. I had a lot of students drop because I don't know if they knew it was a game class. I don't think they knew it was a game class because it's named New Media. And so I think a lot of them assumed it was going to be a social media class. And when they got in there, I said, we're making a game. Like, oh my God, let me get out of here.
So tell me what a game is to you. Are you making a game when you're animating something?
No, well, they don't quite have the skills for that. So there are text-based games that are in a program called Twine that you can bring into the classroom. It's free. And so they're making essentially adventure books in some ways. Choose your own adventure. Yeah. And it's really accessible. It's all, there are great books out there. It's mostly semantically written in English, so the language itself is very English-based. You sort of move boxes around to make the program come alive, and the 10 students today are having a great time. So, but you know, it frightened people off, and I completely understand, because I probably would have run too. So if there are no more questions so far, I'm going to just pull up some examples. All right, so I've just labeled them in terms of sort of how I categorize them. I usually teach technical communication. That's really my main specialty. And so on the easy side, my tech comp kids always have to do those things in that category. I force them to use Google Docs, and I completely believe that Google Docs is a multimodal tool, mostly because of the way you can work with others and shove any kind of things into them. And in fact, all of my classes, I spend time teaching them how to use Google Docs and then force them to turn in links with it. Mostly because peer review gets so easy. So then I can just say, you know, send the link over to so-and-so and peer review it, and you can see the comments and all that. So let me see, I have some of these already open, probably not in the right order. So let's see if I go from the end over here, or maybe, oops, that was interesting. We're not gonna wonder what happened. We're just gonna keep clicking. So this is one of the, down below you'll see when I flip back over, I also have them do that reflection stage. So all of my larger projects have students do what I call a debrief. So talk to me about how you did this, what choices you made in the document, maybe what tools you sought, did they work out? And there's usually a draft stage, so right, so what changed between your draft and your final? What was your process? And just, you know, I'm gonna give you points for whatever you write anyway, but give me, since technical communication, give it to me in a memo, put some nice figures in it, show me your before and after, and talk about your process. So this particular one, I actually have on my door, on the front of my office, and people, my colleagues think I'm weird, but you know, that's okay. Because this one is a really interesting one. So one of the students at Tech did this one. Oops, come on, open up. I know there's a way to zoom in there. So this one, they could have qualitative or quantitative data. So this is qualitative data. This is Spider-Man throughout the decades or years or whatever you call this thing. And he did this in one of those programs. And so he took action shots. He did a number of different variations of this with the different actions. And at that time, I had them come and consult me in the office. We all had to have a meeting before you went further. And at first, it was you couldn't tell that it was a timeline. And so he made some minor renovations to some of the things and put the line in and changed the dates a bit. And so it came out really nice. And I also have his reflection on this particular. So you can see how he talked about he wanted all the actions to be, to make sense, and how he had to knock out the backgrounds and all this, and the various poses that he wanted to look for. And in this one, I let the students choose their topics. So I'm always torn between, you know, letting them pick or picking something for them, and I kind of oscillate. So this is one of the semesters where it's like, oh, whatever, I'm tired of looking at these things, I'm not assigning this. So pick whatever you want. So I get Spider-Man, which is cool. I also had a student who did Godzilla. I was pretty fascinated. So you can see that, and he used picture charts, so here's him talking about his tools, and what he went through to get the graphics in there, and how much time it took to make this thing. So that's one example. Come on, stop. So in my technical communication class, I often have students make manuals, instruction manuals. And it's funny, I love giving students choice, but it seems to take them the longest time to pick something. So the years where I'm feeling like, you know, I don't want you to spend 14 weeks on trying to figure out what you want to do, I assign them random things. And Google to me is low-hanging fruit. They're all free. I can always say, go make some instructions about some maps or whatever. And so that was one of these semesters. And so all the students that year had some kind of a Google document, and they picked the various documents. So this student team did Gmail, Chrome, and Maps. And as you can see, you know, TechCom, we have to have all the table of contents and you know, various signals in the page so you know whether or not you're going through. But you can see it's very visual, right? So they've taken time to even put shadows underneath the various pictures, and to make it so that it would be easy for the audience to read. Now, I'm not trying to say all my students can do something that's nice. I'm showing you right now some of my favorite examples, and then I'll show you some of the ones that, you know, well, they tried really hard. So this is one of my favorite ones. And then here's just an example of sort of the, when I have them write a memo and ask them to include, you know, some kind of visual information in the memo about whatever they talked about. I often try to drill into their heads that they should put figure numbers. As you can see, that doesn't always come across. As well as mentioning the item, you know, mention the item before you get to the item. That's not always in here either. Lately, I've come to understand if I keep drilling that and I make them write 1 million memos, they'll eventually get around to it. But unfortunately, that's the only way I can figure out how to get it. I don't know why that little bitty minutia just seems to be beyond me. But they like sticking graphics and things, so that seems to come across pretty cool. And I've been lately keeping a huge list of just cool student projects, because that modeling thing, students need examples of what they can make, right? In some ways, they need their mind expanded for what's possible. I don't know why this thing moved down here. Let's see, I didn't pull up the game. So that semester, I did an alternate reality game. And that thing takes all semester. So when they make a game, I usually give them all semester to make it. Oh, that's not the right thing. I'll have to look around for that one. And so this one, they had to come up with the game itself, the various things you would play. Since alternate reality games are really not games themselves, they're sort of like marketing campaigns with sort of a gamified thing underneath them. And so this one I'm going to show you if I can find it. They took Uber and sort of gamified it, and they made flyers and brochures and stuff for the Uber to get Uber going. Is this the right folder? No, that's not. So give me a second while feel free to ask questions while I float around and look for random things that I thought I had up here.
Some of the stuff that you're talking about sounds like, I mean, the 6 steps that you talked about, for example, that sounds like it takes a lot of class time.
It does.
So how do you balance that with the subject matter of the class?
Usually when I do the, usually when I get a chance to do those 6 steps, I make them broad projects. And then since I teach technical communication, I have a lot of leeway to not have large books to read and things like that. So for example, in my technical communication class right now, they're actually making a board game. Anybody who's played a board game in the last 5 years knows there's more tech comm on a board game than almost any other device you can think of. So the game part is 3 lectures, let's look at some games, let's play some games, here's some game information. Now let's start making them. And when they collaborate, that's part of one of my lists of things they have to do in TechCom. So they collaborate, and then now they're designing pieces, back to being TechCom. Then they start writing all the instructions, total TechCom. So I've got an easy subject to sort of squeeze it all in. What I typically do is front load it. So you get all of the content in the first 8 weeks, and then all of the stuff you produce that takes forever is in the last 8 weeks. So since for our semester we just crossed over to week 9, I don't even lecture anymore. They come to class, they get in their group, and they do their thing. And I come around and say, how's the thing going? Did you meet over the weekend? Like this last class, I have 8 students, and so they're working on the same game, but I put them in different groups because they had slightly divergent ideas. And over the weekend, I told them, go home, you 4 come up with your version of the game, you come up with your version of the game, you come back and you play it. And you guys figure out which one we're going to move forward with. And that went tremendously well. They had all the little pieces and parts all drawn out, and they sat and played. And we just had a guest speaker about 2 weeks ago, and he kept drilling into their heads. He came to class and said, it has to be fun. It can't just be a game. It's not a game if it's not fun. And while that's, we can split hairs over whether or not that's accurate any longer, to them it resonated. And so when they played through their different versions, one team says, ours is certainly more fun. And they were like, yes, we agree. So they started to sort of merge with that information in mind. So with other topics though, we had colleagues back at Tech that had English. And a few of the things that they did with multimodality were really, really cool. For example, they did the, it's not exactly called remix. What is it called when you take a movie and you turn it into a book?
Adaptation.
Adaptation, thank you. So they did a lot of multimodality with adaptation. So they would have the text that they would read for one of the texts they would read for the semester, and they would say, make a movie trailer for your book, right? Or retool this. This was a movie, make it into a book. Or this was a short story, make it into a poster. And that's how they sort of integrated multimodality in it. And it was so cool. And some of them, they had them even remix on top of the adaptation. So they would take, if they had a movie in class, they would say, okay, take the clips from the new movie that came out that's on the same topic and remix it. And they would put them in groups and then have them redo the trailer to something cool and voice the whole thing over. And so Patty did some of those things, and that was really, really cool. And students resonated with that. I mean, as well as having them do projects, make the project come to life. So if you're reading about, say, Moby Dick, you know, I want you to make me a paper mache whale, and, you know, it's sort of a panorama of how the whole thing went down, things like that. Yes?
I had, when I was teaching at Auburn, I had a project where I assigned my mostly non-major early world literature students had to, in small groups, somehow do a presentation on a small section of Beowulf. And I had a couple of students one day come in and they had a cage, wrestling cage set up. And they had little stick puppets for a cage match, wrestling match between Grendel and Beowulf that did result in tearing off the paper arm at the end of it. So they did this strange presentation of we're going to have a wrestling cage match. And then another one of those depicting the fight with Grendel's mother resulted in stuffed animals being thrown across the room as he swam through the water and monsters fell on people. And then when Grendel's mother lost her head, a melon suddenly went rolling down the aisle between all of the seats. I vividly remember these students.
So there are awesome things you can do with multimodality.
And that's not necessarily using the technology.
Right, right.
I did have one group, a student knew where the green screen on Auburn's campus was and convinced his group mates to stand in front of the green screen and do various actions. And then he animated it with backgrounds from video games.
That's really cool too.
The student who did all the tech side of it was the kind who was absolutely terrified to even stand up and talk in class. So he walked in that day, turned off the lights, hid behind the podium, cued it, and hit play. and it worked.
So there's ways to sort of, you know, and it doesn't all have to be about technology. On my end, it usually is because I'm usually looking for a document of some sort. I would love to be able to figure out how to, I tried one semester, and this is really one of the only semesters that I've got my students to actually make the video game. Previously, to make the board game. Previous semesters, I sort of gave them a choice and they just wimped out. You know, they were writing about it, but they just didn't want to go to the next step and make it. So I retooled it so that was the project. Making the game was a project, and you still wrote about it, but now they're actually making it. So I'll actually get pieces back this time instead of it all being electronic, which I think is such an important skill. Just being able to print. Today, knowing the sizes and how things print out, nobody remembers how to do that anymore, and hardly know, you know, what kind of images go in particular types of documents, the kinds of images to use, and the sizes of the images. And so I sort of go through all those things as well. Maybe before we leave, I'll find that folder. I don't know where it went to. So on the list of difficult things are, again, games, video demos. I usually try to get students to do video demos. Depending on the student, sometimes it's easier than I would think. I used to teach at a community college for a little while, and I love them doing these video demos. And what I did with those guys, because they didn't really have access to any technology, is I was like, if you have a phone, let's use your phone. I didn't require them to edit it, so they didn't need to do that. But let's take your phone and, you know, show me how to do something. Or give, like one of them I do is just give me an introduction to, you know, whatever you're going to talk about. So like here's one, I don't know if you have any audio here. So, and I don't make sure, they don't have to necessarily have lots of cool imagery, but just getting it all together and talking about how it works is the important part.
Hi, my name is Stephen Gillen, and today I will be talking about how to use Google Groups to make a collaborative inbox group. As the name suggests, Google Groups is a web app on the Google site that allows the creation of groups that are used for a variety of purposes.
And so it doesn't have to be that long. I usually limit them to a max of 6 minutes because, you know, I do have to grade them. And if you don't say, oh my God, don't make it longer than 6 minutes, they come back 20 minutes. Flyers to me usually are low-hanging fruit.
group?
Here's one that some of my students made a billion years ago. Some community college students made with random boxes. It's supposed to be for a conference and the various areas that the conference people could go to and stuff like that. So I sort of squeeze it in almost any place I can get it in at, and most of the time the students resonate with it, especially if I take the tool out of the situation. The more I try to say use a specific tool, students get lost in some instances about how to get started and where to go and what to do. And if I can just sort of get them to collaborate with each other on what's working for them, that has seemed to go a bit better with the kinds of students that I've run into so far. Now, admittedly, UAH and Georgia Tech were more traditional age students. When I worked with my students at community college, they were non-traditional students, which means bringing them the cell phones and, you don't have to edit it, just redo it. If you've got some stuff in there you don't want, just redo it, and working with more accessible technologies like being able to use Word or something like that to create posters and flyers, etc. One of the last things I wanted to talk about, and then we can just open up the floor if you guys have any more questions, was about being able to grade it, so assessments. Georgia Tech, I think, helped a lot with thinking through assessment because they did it on rubrics. So one of the easiest ways, especially with multimedia projects being so very different, trying to grade something that comes back as essentially a house and a pyramid and is tangible and a poster really becomes difficult. So putting together some kind of a rubric helps. And so one of the ways that they talked about making rubrics was start with the student objectives for the class. So in this case, for multimodality, you're gonna move down and just keep going back. Okay, whatever. So for technical communication, it's typically organizational and support, which is citing your sources, organizing your documents. Then there's the document design elements, and then scoring these so that they're weighted appropriately. So since my course emphasizes audience and purpose, that stays preeminent in my course. You can make the coolest looking thing, but if you didn't get to your audience or make sure that you emphasize your purpose, then you don't get the kinds of points, even though it's beautiful.
You might want to add something here. If any of you do these kinds of projects, you don't have to necessarily invent your own rubric. The art department has tons of rubrics. I mean, we do flyers, we do posters, we do all sorts of visual things that sound like some of the things that you're teaching. So if you're hunting for rubrics, a good source might be to ask the art department or even look out there in interweb land for rubrics about art.
Absolutely.
And then you can reweigh.
Exactly, then you can change the weighting.
Yeah.
So here's an example. So this is I think this is the Georgia Tech rubrics. Hello, Mousy, where did you go? Just right here. Here we go. And so, yeah. So they have essentially a 6-scale thing where it's basic, and that's where you put the student: basic, beginning, developing, confident, mature, exemplary. And then down the left side is the various items. So in this case, there's response to the audience, the author, the stance, the purpose, etc. And then down below, the design for medium, etc. And then again, you weight those things. I also brought in one of my other colleagues, Adaptation, to this, because she just recently did it. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. One of the things that we include in technical communication is this concept of 6 C's of communication. I've added one, I've added 2, actually there are 8. So something like credibility, coherence, completeness, those kinds of things in a document. And so she took those concepts and wove them into that kind of rubric. So where she has the main criteria on the left-hand side, rhetorical awareness and purpose and support, and then she has the information about what she's looking for, and then on this side, when she adds in her information, it will say, coherence, or didn't follow coherence, didn't follow completeness, etc., so that she can re-emphasize those concepts inside technical communication.
Just to be fun, I like that you used fun in your game. In our classes, our students design their rubric. They help, they help us, they help determine the criteria for, and then they have to design it so it looks like an artist made it. And the other thing, when we critique infographics, we can only critique infographics about how to make an infographic.
Well, that's funny.
And there are a lot of them out there. If you Google, how to make an infographic, you will find infographics about that. And some of them are horribly designed.
Terrible.
So just to sort of recap, I put down a couple notes because I know I'm probably rambled all over the place. One of the things I meant to mention if I did it was you don't have to know anything about the software to have an assignment that might involve the software. You can help point them in the right direction for how to get at it, but that you don't necessarily have to have known how to do it, especially if you don't do anything complicated like games. Well, when I started teaching my game class, I decided I should know a little bit about it. Over the summer, I took more time than they needed than I gave them. I learned how to use the software, so when they came to me and said, I don't understand what this is going, so here's the reference that I use when I try to find out why this thing is doing this thing, and you can go use the same thing. Students, at least the traditional students, know a lot more about these technologies than I will ever know. And so leveraging their knowledge is always helpful. Non-traditional students don't necessarily know as much, and then you can just sort of set the bar a little bit lower and continue to let them use the technologies that they're comfortable with. Their cell phones, their printers, if they're using laptops, their laptops, if they're using cameras at home, their cameras. Grade by rubric because it helps to standardize against different assignments, whether it's for a report with visuals in it or if it's a game. Try to include debrief as a reflection step. I can't imagine. I sort of haphazardly had reflection at tech, and then I always encourage you gotta have reflection, but it's a lot of crap you gotta build into the classroom as it is, right? And then of course you gotta grade it. And so this last 2 semesters, I've absolutely stuck to my guns and said, for every single assignment, there's a reflection step. So the projects have a debrief, and then there's a reflection at the end of the week, which then includes all the assignments. And it has been remarkable about what students say in them and the kinds of ways they think back over what they've done. And I can't say that I've had any classes, comprehend some of the things that they're thinking about now by just having them write a 300-word reflection at the end of these things. So I can't say enough about them. I think they're awesome. And I still have to grade them. And tools come and go, so my recommendation is just don't spend time on them. Give the students a slate of tools to choose from if you can, and let them run with it. If you force them into a tool, it might be more problematic. I do try to steer students away from using inappropriate tools. So no, you cannot take a spreadsheet and shove it into Word. That's going to give you more drama than you really want. But picking a tool that you feel comfortable with doing these things, especially in my area, since it's not really that important. I try to make sure that they have the basic business writing tools. Past that, pick anything else. So that's kind of all I have. Do you guys have any questions?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming and for your awesome kind of run through. I think this has been a wonderful kind of give and take, and thank you so much for this, and let's continue the conversation, and but I want you guys to be able to go about your day, so.
I have cards if anybody wants to email me or contact me or whatever, and I'll share this out when I get home if you guys are interested in keeping these notes that I have here.
Thank you.
Thank you.